I don't know that I'm,
Go ahead.
yeah, moving forward, I don't know that I'm gonna ever do death as a standalone topic anymore because
Okay.
really what the through line for me is this concept of tantra, which, gets
Yeah.
diluted and distorted and confusing. And, there's 1,000 names and 10,000 expressions of it. But
Right.
for me, in a word, in a sentence, in a phrase, it is the art of living, right? And you get better at the art of living when you look at the art of dying. And so these are like, interwoven DNA strands in my work and in my life. And so I had been keeping these two topics really separate in my life because I thought, oh, people are going to hear tantra and think sex. And now I'm
Hmm.
like, I don't care. Like it
Right.
is life force. And so, these are the two halves of the yin yang, and they are the merged soulmates. So that's sort of how in my heart, how I hold it.
Tantra is such a great jumping off point because for at least from my kind of angle, it for one immediately gets us into the realm of paradox because my understanding of tantra is on the one hand my understanding of tantra is that it was a kind of evolution of uh some of these eastern messages, like the Buddha went from eating a grain of rice a day to having figured this thing out, having figured out some kind of allowing and trust and acceptance and some kind of flow, some kind of embodiment of all of it, taking all of that in and without judgment, just saying, well, this is life happening, something's going on here. And he's sitting there eating a bowl of porridge or whatever, and the other, you know, gurus come to him and are like, hey, what the heck are you doing? You're supposed to be eating one grain of rice a day. And he's like, no, full stop. You don't, you don't get it. Right. And so we're playing into this, it's kind of a funny thing to say, but so Gordon White is one of my favorite thinkers in terms of animism and things like this. I don't agree with everything he says, but has he puts Platonism. Okay, he puts this kind of mind, this kind of dualistic mentality, specifically in the Platonic context, in this way. And I love this. I love to start conversations like this. I love this idea of tantra. So he says that Platonism can be summarized by saying matter bad, spirit good. And to the extent to which there's this tantric move, which is kind of like an evolution, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, you've got Advaita Vedanta and all these other things in there. But we commit this fallacy both in our organized religion and very, very, very much so. This is something I'm really passionate about. Very much so in the kind of cobbled together new age spirituality that that a lot of people have kind of glommed onto as a solution to something without this tantric component, without an ear and an eye to the divinity of absolutely everything. Full stop. So the tantra, my understanding of tantra is that it is the divination of the world through our perception without any effort on our part. And this is very much in line with the message that I find myself talking about. I don't call it tantra, but my understanding of tantra is totally in line with that. So is you talk about tantra being the art of living, and when I think of tantra, I think of this kind of the spiritualization of matter and the materialization of spirit and that kind of interplay there is not actually something that asks anything of us. It's not a behavior, it's not a performance. It's not something that we're not enjoying to like be in the world in any particular way other than the way in which we find ourselves in the moment in which we find ourselves. And that is a turn. Yeah. What do you think, Lee?
Mm. You know, one of the many, many things I love about Tantra is that um, it's always, it's not there, it's an impossibility to dogmatize it, right? And like when
Yes.
people say like, this is the definition of Tantra, I think of Tantra being like, yes, exact opposite. This is the definition of tantra. Yes. You know, like it's all tantra
Right.
in a way. And I love
Right.
that. Um yes, and I think that the essence or one of the seed crystals of the thing you were talking about is called in tantra often the sacred marriage. You know, this
Mhm.
idea that we are marrying opposites, you know, and that and the one of the core of those that we have separated for so long culturally and through religious abuse in a way is the separation between spirit and matter. And many systems, many traditions are bringing those back together at this time. But from my perspective, how I read things, Tantra's been doing that for eons,
Right.
right? And it never really, it never fell into the separation of spirit and matter because how could you separate Shakti and Shiva?
Mhm.
How could you separate in breath and out breath? How could you separate life and death, living and dying? There is no separating it. It's much like the Tao in that way,
Mm.
you know.
Mhm.
Um, or Zen in that way. It's looking at the principles of the universe and making sense of them in ways that are artful. You know, I think another definition of Tantra that I love is it's a book of questions because the questions are always changing and yet they're all real, true, cosmic oriented questions are mystical. We're
Yeah.
always in this mystical inquiry, and it's the
Yeah.
target is always moving. What fun would life be if it wasn't always moving? You know, if we somehow could figure it out, we wouldn't be enchanted. Hmm.
Uh, mm, the definition of tantra, you said that yes, that's the and yes, that too, and yes, that too. So yes, there's this radical permittance and accept and sort of like this self-assimilation of all perspectives. And that's the thing that what I think we both mean by tantra. I think one of the things that it's doing is it's widening, it's doing what I call zooming out uh, sufficiently so as to render all perspectives as both kind of like holistically inclusive of everything that could ever possibly be said. And one of the things that I take, not that I take anything seriously, but I find that often when we ask questions of ourselves or of life or of science or philosophy or each other or anything like that, we engage in what we call narrow focus, what Les Femi calls, narrow focus on the object of inquiry. And we sort of, we apply this linearly oriented uh, way of seeing to the question and to the answer and think that we essentially like try and make science out of everyday things, right? And you said that it's that the perspectives that we come up with are artful. I found that absolutely fascinating, and also there's a paradox there too. You said that they're artful answers to the most important questions, or something like that. And there's a lot there. There's a lot there, Lee. But what I love is that you and I are absolutely going to be just simply doing the only thing that we could ever possibly do in language, which is to dance around, you said the Tao, around whatever it is that's could ever possibly be going on here, this singular thing. The whole thing that you and I think, most deeply connected right from the get go is the concept of an immovable center. So you've got right out the gate, you've got this paradox of the radical inclusiveness of all possible perspectives. So there's this subjectivity and intersubjectivity to our individual ways of languaging what's going on here. And at the same time, Tantra, I think, also would tell us that the union of Shiva and Shakti is so absolute that there's nowhere to go from that perspective, that I can't use not in truth, not in reality, in this way, which again is a paradox. I can't use Shiva Shakti unified or the Tao as a footstool to then make any sense of the world in terms of the way that my consciousness wants to bifurcate it and split it. Yeah.
Say that last piece again. That's worth repeating.
I can't use Shiva and Shakti as a footstool to try and make sense of the world in a way. Like, that's what's actually going on, is this union. And so, in other words, again, there's always paradox here, but the and the the truth with a capital T is this kind of ineffable, absolute, universal absolute, this immovable center. And it's both mysterious, it is unified with itself to the extent to which I, in my artful way of living and of seeing the world, I can see a reflection of it in myself or in my own life, then I'm doing something. Then that's that kind of delicious, beautiful tantric way of being in the world, that just what it does, talk about reproduction, it multiplies itself in its own, in its seeing of itself as what it is. And what we do with these conscious minds is we mm, we try and take this fundamental unity, and we try and create for ourselves stable footing, which is ultimately not stable, but we try and perceive under our feet something which we can stand on to make sense of the world in a way that I can refer to in the future as being stable and solid. Science, in other words. Science and the conscious mind's tendency to see separation and identify with separation.
Yeah,
Um,
let's
yeah,
get back to science. I want to post-it note science, but I
yeah.
want to highlight what's happening between us right now by saying, what if the entire universe was a creation, was an act of lovemaking?
Hmm.
What if, what if what
Yeah,
if our conversation is an act of lovemaking? What
absolutely.
if the elements here of the marriage, of this moment, and even in the genders that you and I are expressing, which, I could certainly get in trouble for this all the way around, but let's
Go
just
ahead.
play with it. Let me take the
Go ahead.
risk.
Yeah, go ahead.
Your structure, your framework, your foundation, and Tantra is very much this metaphor of the riverbank and the river. The water needs the structure of
Mhm.
the riverbank, right? But the water is the life force. We're only here for the water. Like, we only care about the water, but we need the riverbank, right?
Right, right.
And without the riverbank, we're gonna have a mud puddle. We're gonna have overflowing, destruction. We need containment, and
Mhm.
this is the relationship we would talk about, like, your beautiful intellect and your, in many ways, your beautiful maleness, like, and because we are so in harmony about these things, it triggers the sort of yin in me to like go, oh, yes, it's Shakti. It Shaktis me. This is because this is my tantric path. I'm in a deep feminine devotional path, but yet this conversation is like opening my heart,
Right.
and all I want to do is talk about love making in even as regards to death, even
Right.
as regards to what either of us are doing in our lives, even as regards to
Yeah.
what this conversation may elicit in other people. It's all lovemaking, all
Yep.
of it,
Yep.
and so, I think so to circle back to science and say it is one half of the lovemaking. We have a
Mhm.
basically a masturbatory experience. We have one half of the equation. The other half is mystical. We know nothing, right? I was having this conversation last week in our last class of this 13-week end of life immersion course that I was teaching, which is the definition of entropy is now in science whatever we don't know. Like, how much do you actually think we know? We know nothing. We know a pinprick and a piece of paper about the body, about the heart, about life, about the universe, about it. Nothing. Shakti is the nothing, right? Shakti is the we know nothing.
Mhm.
It's the river, and the
Mhm.
what we think we know is the riverbank, and science is claiming to know and
Mhm.
wants, and it's beautiful. There's but true scientists who are really leaning consistently
Right.
into not knowing are
Right.
almost non-existent. And then they flip over and guess what they become? They become mystics. They
Yeah.
become, when you are truly leaning into I know nothing, you're a scientist and a mystic, right? So
Um,
it's like it's the snake, it's the Ouroboros, it's the snake
yeah.
eating its tail.
Mhm.
Yeah. Anyway, there's my enthusiasm for you. Shakti.
Absolutely beautiful. And the point, so what's funny is, thank you. Thank you, Lee. And my intention is I found myself, it's funny as I'm reflecting, I'm like, I can wax philosophical, right, about the nature of the thing which cannot be languaged. And I can do that. And what is also important to me, there's this kind of practical component. It says in the Tao Te Ching, chapter 67, it says, people say my philosophy is lofty and impractical, but to those who plumb its depths, they will find it deep, and who to those who use it, they will find it most practical. So, hmm, on the one hand, there's these artful, like there's this holistic kind of tantric artful way of seeing and accepting. And on the other hand, there's the question of, well, what the hell do I do with this mystical philosophy? And of course, my answer to that is, well, it's actually, first of all, ironically, you don't need to do anything with anything. So there's no answer to how, what do I do? And yet at the same time, to the extent to which I dance, I kind of like, um, as you're talking, I'm seeing my own message as like both yin and yang, yes, and seeing, like, I'm holding on to, in a way, which is which is, I love this. I love this because it's a paradox also. Uh, I'm holding on for dear life to the thing which cannot be held on to. And there's this that point of intercourse. There is a there is some mysteriously, and the Taoists talk a lot about this. There is mysteriously some point. It's like a pointless point in spaceless space of union. There's if yin and yang, to the extent to which my consciousness again wants to bifurcate the world into these disparate components or energies or something, uh they are they both exist as manifestations of something separate from one another, yet in their essence are unified. And if that's the case, where do they meet? Where do they touch? And
Uh,
so for me, there is this kind of perspective which I can hold onto, again, just to use this kind of uh, purposefully problematic, paradoxical language, right? I'm holding on for dear life to the thing which cannot be held onto. There's a pivot, there's a spine, there's a way of centering myself as uh squarely, equally wholly between heaven and earth, and watching what unfolds from there. So yes, on the one hand, science is like usefulness. It's like the ultimate yang expression of usefulness itself. And what I find super, super fascinating, to your point, I quote this thing all the time. I make this quote all the time, but I forget who it is that said it. I may actually have been Schrodinger. If not, it was Pauli, or one of the these sort of grandfathers of quantum mechanics, said that at the first sip of the glass of the natural sciences, you are an atheist, right? And at the bottom of the glass, God is waiting for you. And you've got these guys who ran their mathematics. This is before we had any experimental evidence about entanglement or um, superposition, or any of these or quantum tunneling, or any of the effects that they see, the weird ways in which this kind of hologram can kind of uh, like overlap itself. The perception of space and time can kind of like fold in on itself in ways that break our meaning making machine about the world. Probability, things start to look more like they function in terms of probability. And then if you tinker with the instrumentation, they start to, the probability keeps its functions, but you can push it into more of a yin or a yang expression of itself. So all of these guys, these guys, Marie Curie and these people notwithstanding, but the sort of forefathers of quantum mechanics, they were absolutely mystics, and Schrodinger slept with the Bhagavad Gita under his pillow. And so what is funny about what you're talking about is, I was at my favorite hot spring resort in New Mexico recently here, and one of the people that I really connected with, just a guy that I was soaking with, was this person in the natural sciences. He was, this guy had experience not colliding electrons, because I don't think they know how to do that, but he had an electron accelerator, and he was doing all sorts of experiments at the university level on deep physics, man. Like, you know, was as qualified of a scientist in the physical sciences as anyone. And statistically, this is true, right? That people who are in the physical sciences often have a religious foundation to how they see the world. This is statistically the case for them. Um, I think that's valuable. I think that's fascinating. I think that it's nice when, however, we try and marry these things, social perspectives and scientific perspectives, or philosophical perspectives and scientific perspectives, which is a false dichotomy. All that's a false dichotomy. Uh, it's fun when we can appreciate that there's something else going on here other than the contents of what my conscious mind thinks it understands. So
Hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure which thread to pick up there.
I
There's
know,
so
it's
many
like,
good ones. I made some notes. I was gonna actually go look for a similar quote. The
yeah,
natural scientist that's not the mystic is not the natural scientist. Like there was a book back in the 70s that became really popular for the conjunction of reasons, but it was Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance,
yeah,
and
Persic,
there's
Persic.
yeah,
Mhm,
yeah. And so you had asked, like, how is mysticism helpful? I mean, there's so many ways to come. How is it
mm,
practical? How is it helpful? And I think from the Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, or however, biohacking, or whatever these days we would call it, like, whatever you're into, your relationship with all that is only going to make whatever you're into more fun. And it's going to make you better at it. Like, that's just sort of, that is the science about the thing, right? And on another hand, I will say, I don't know, why did we come here? Why did we incarnate here? Many people have many theories, but the real interesting part of it is that every single one of us asks those questions. We're all, if we,
right,
if at any point in our lives, incarnated in these bodies, we ask the question, what is this about? We are a mystic. That's all that's required. That's
right,
all that is required, which means we're all mystics. And, some of us
mm,
would like to be, are good at, or have an orientation to, or have an affinity for being in those spaces a lot of the time. And we might be poets, or we might be philosophers, or we might be, academics, or whatever it is, where we're like really pondering these questions, and that's great. That's our place on the wheel. It's not better or worse than someone who's a janitor, or someone who's running a dump truck, or whatever else.
mm,
We all have our place, but I think to minimize mysticism is much how we minimize the right hemisphere of the brain. We minimize, and it atrophies. Our imaginations atrophy, our perception of artism, artistic nature, our perception of slow food, our perception of slow sex, our perception of real relationships, our perception of how to care for our children in a healthy and attached way. This all atrophies, right? Because we overemphasize the sort of, sorry, yeah, the left brain around, like, the linear, structured, oriented way of being in the world. It's like taking art out of schools and thinking that's a good idea in the long term, right? That we're not going to
or recess.
cultivate. Right. We're not going to cultivate the soul or the artistic expression of our children, that we're just going to teach them these linear topics, and that somehow we won't lose the soul of our own essence, of our
Mm,
own culture,
mm,
And so I think, yeah, you're yeah, you spoke to it so beautifully, but I think, is mysticism practical? Well, I'll just tell you this from a perspective about death. It makes the difference between being terrified of dying and being celebratory of dying.
in love
And to
with it.
me, the difference between those two things, is universal. Like, I don't even know how to quantify the difference between being terrified of dying and being celebratory of dying. That's what mysticism does to us. Having sacred relationships, having a big picture view of what's going on here and what's happening within us. I mean, to me, we could all use a bigger dose of all of that.
And it comes in so many different forms, and for so many people, this is actually entirely satisfied by uh, their their religiosity or their religion. What I think
Yeah.
is really interesting is that um, I talk about God a lot in my message, and we've been seeing a kind of turn in the social sphere of um, people languaging this in a way that isn't strictly your kind of consensus prepackaged new age uh, cosmology of whatever words we have for higher power. For for me, I think so. So mysticism, and again, mysticism as well is maligned, depending on the religious assumptions of whatever denomination or whatever it is. I know there's certain Christian denominations that the M word here is bad because it says somewhere, God is no respecter of persons. God is no respecter of persons, and I think uh,
But the Christian mystics were some of the greatest mystics that ever lived.
Meister Eckhart. Are
Yeah.
you kidding?
Yeah,
So, um,
exactly.
so, um, uh, my God, William Blake. Um, uh, and I couldn't get into Jakob Burma or Jacob Boehm. I couldn't get into Jakob Burma, but anyway, uh, you know, to say God is no respecter of persons, or there is a sort of a trope that I've heard in especially in certain denominations. I'm not going to name names, but I've heard this trope that make sure that you are worshiping the God of of the of the text of our sacred text, and not the God of your own imagination. And um and then they there's God is no respecter of persons. And I think, well, first of all, the interesting turn in the conversation, but for one thing, that is, to me, to my mind, that is actually in part a uh, a forgetting of the entire Protestant impulse in the first place, which is that there are no mediators between me and my relationship with the divine. That is some perception of another person, or even, to taken to its logical end, taken to its logical extreme, even the text itself, or whatever set of doctrines I hold sacred in this tradition. uh the divine itself is nearer than anything past the tips of my fingers, right? And so um that, on the one hand, is important to me, and on the other hand, God being no respecter of persons, I have a sort of a reframe here where in the union of Shiva and Shakti, at this point in spaceless space of whatever's going on there, you don't exist. The person right now who thinks that their name is Connor and they're making their mouth move and words are coming out, right? This whole perception of linear time and space is something that you and I would agree, I think, uh, um, God is both so intimately, like, to say that God is in that uh, makes it is almost it's a misnomer, right? Um, to even imply that there is anywhere which God is not, on the one hand, and on the other, the very perception of the thing itself, the very invitation in time that my life has brought me to the moment in which I find myself making my mouth move to make the words come out, which say uh, that there is nothing which is not divine, is um, is the invitation of God into the perception of itself as what it is. So I kind of alluded to earlier this like hall of mirrors. Laura Rose Gage calls it like the infinity mirror effect when you tilt it the right angle and you see the things, or your Zoom room, because uh, that's the kind of playground that we're playing in here as childlike imitators of God. That is, as it says in the Torah. So, um,
Uh, I mean, this has been available to um, maybe high initiates for a long time, but here's what
mm,
I think is happening now, which is and we give the new age a hard time as we should, and yet I believe that there's been a progression, and the new age has
yeah,
been important, much like
right.
science has been important. They are almost like polar opposites of each other. They keep each other like lifted up. Um, but I think here's what's happening around, and I'm going to bring in the concept of sacred marriage again, which is for the first time in human history, let's say modern human history, I don't know, some amount of time, we are really as a species coming to question and coming to recognize that this idea that we are God, that is radical. That is a very radical idea. And the way that that's going to be, like realized is, you know, involution and evolution meeting, right? The making love of involution and evolution, which is complete embodiment, right? And it's almost the biggest paradox that we can imagine, which is, what does ascension mean? People think this ascension is up and out. Ascension is actually down and in. Ascension is actually trusting our inhabiting, embodying ourselves, trusting our actual physical, messy existence that is
Mhm,
very in, that does all the things the body does, and
mhm,
being here so fully that our spiritual selves can descend fully inside of us.
mhm,
That is what
mhm,
ascension means. And I think that's where the new age has gotten it a little upside down and backwards. And that's okay because they had a piece of the truth, and they're, you know, building on the industrial revolution where, the ideas that we were machines and like, no, there's something higher, right? Like integration is what's happening now,
mm,
and certainly there are innovators and there are early adopters, and there's some of us who can hear the field, feel the field, see what's happening and what coming. And the reason we're reaching for these mystics, the reason that we're calling on these people who've sort of seen the way. Rilke is another one for me. I'm like,
mm,
oh my God, that man and his ability to live in the causal plane, I mean, just takes me to my knees,
mhm,
and the reason we're reaching for these people because this is our time, right? And
mhm,
this is for the everyday man, woman, person to be here, to be in
mhm,
their divinity, which is
mm,
inside their physical being, inside here. And so when you say God is no further than my fingertips, absolutely, it's no further than our heartbeat. It's no
mhm,
further than every cell of our. Greg Braden talks about this, where whoever wrote the God molecule, like it's in here. And the way we unlock it, because there is an unlocking process that needs to happen, is we have to work through our trauma, and we have to work through our stories, and we have to own our shadows, which is 90% of who we are. It's not some
mhm,
nice shiny surface. And we have to
mhm,
get in the mess. We have to be willing to be in this mess in order to flip on those God molecules. That's how it's happening. And this is the inner marriage. This is the sacred marriage
mm.
of spirit and matter. And it's messy and it's not what many of us want most of the time. And it's, you have to feel a lot of feelings that we don't like to feel, like terror. And
Mhm.
that's where the action is happening. That's where it's happening. And so if we want to, start to see, look ahead at like where the new human is, this is where it is. It's embodied. And that's what the new age didn't have legs underneath the ideas that were going on, right? And this
Wow.
is where
Mhm.
science needs its other half. Like, this is where we're integrating all of these pieces.
Fascinating. Okay. On the one hand, you have, um, I think what, yes, you hear me poo poo the new age quite a bit, and I don't actually poo poo anything. I just observe, and uh, it's also pretty nuanced out there as well, because there's so many different expressions of it, as you damn well know. And we also have the emergence of kind of like secular scientific new age. There's people like Joe Dispenza who say that science is the modern language of mysticism, and uh, I think this is false. I think this is actually not. I don't think that that's true. I think what we mean by those different concepts are distinct enough in their expression in the world and what we mean by them to for me to make the claim. I don't actually think that that's right. So, on the one hand, no, you and I would, I think, agree on this. I say this in Trusting Your Foundation. I say that the language of mysticism is poetry. The language of mysticism is the feeling that emerges in me of rapture and awe, and all of that. I don't need to qualify it. The what that is an emergent property of the moment in which I find myself in, as an agent of consciousness, experiencing consciousness in some, at some place in these dimensions of space and time. And so there is a essence and a core, there's a heart that is this kind of unmoved mover, this immovable center that somehow spatially, non-spatially is like the center of that. And simultaneously it is itself, it is its own essence, it is the thing which is looking out in this kind of fractal toroidal holographic self-perception, self invitational way to perceive itself as what it is. Okay, like all that is happening. It's really only one thing happening. There's only one thing happening. And to me, I use the word quibble. I'm going to quibble with you, Lee. And I think our conception of, again, and I know you'll agree with this, right? So I'm not really quibbling with you, but the perception of anything one outside of the one thing which it is that we actually are when we perceive ourselves and the world and life correctly being a paradox, correctly being a misnomer, because there's nothing which is incorrect. That's the tantric turn of radical, the kind of unfolding and infolding of being here now. And so we take that mystical perspective, and to say, on the one hand, that the enlivening of God molecules into, or even the ascension, is really a descension of spirit into matter and all this kind of stuff. Again, what and I don't want anyone listening to this to just to because it's nuanced, right? And so, and in being this kind of paradoxical, mystical, tantric perspective on things, we wouldn't, on the one hand, say that the way to do it is to wake up the God mind, and like there's this linear process because um tantra admits of the divinity of every moment in which we find ourselves. And so like when I got on the call with you and I started saying, hey, look, the past few days for me I've been a vegetable the past few days. I've been an absolute vegetable the past few days. I have been I have sent more reels. I don't even have social media apps on my phone. I don't have Instagram on my phone. I don't have Facebook on my phone. I have LinkedIn, right? So I don't scroll reels or shorts. And I have sent more friends, more links to reels and shorts than I have in 6 months in the past 48 hours, right? And uh, part of my journey the past 48 hours, because it's on a short time scale, this whole unfolding, is like I was saying before we hit record, trust, always trust, never not trust, right? Of of Connor's vegetable state as something also divine, right? So, you know, it's really fun to me. Like we have these things like New Age, and we have science, and we have mysticism, and we have quantum mechanics, and we have God God molecules, and we have all these things. And you and I think would agree that it only ever actually ever comes down to my perception of self and world, and how those two things interplay in the moment in which I find myself. So this this tantric turn, the question of where, how practical is this? Well, can we just can we just be? And in just being, is that the mechanism by which these, I'm going to say supposed God molecules, is that the mechanism by which these things come alive in us? What is the mechanism by which uh there's paradoxically some way of seeing the world which is correct? Again, what the hell? There's a way of, you can't possibly fuck this up. You can't possibly fuck this up. And at the same time, life can be enlivened and enriched and um, enchanted, right? By our seeing, by a again, for lack of a better word, a proper act of seeing. So what is that?
Again, I'm never sure which thread to pull. I mean, I could pull the thread of like why practical, why is practical important? I
Yeah.
could pull the thread of like why are some of these Joe Dispenza types walking through the door of science? That's a fascinating conversation. I'm
Yeah.
not actually sure what the quibble was. I was wanting to like go towards the quibble, but I couldn't actually hear it.
Okay. You want me to double
So
down on it? You want me to
yeah,
double down on it? Okay, I'll double down on
yeah.
it. There is nowhere to go. There is nothing to do. And so the extent to which the narrative that emerges from us, that we say when we say, this is how it's got to happen, this is how it's going to be. Um, there's a perspective in me that says, um, again, there's nothing to do and there's nowhere to go. So for me, healing, for me, trauma is a blessing. It's a circumstantial perception of self that invites of itself the seeing of itself as what it actually is in even deeper ways, right? Trauma, it's life asking of you how much separation, how much of this delicious perception of separation could you possibly identify with in this life? Oh my God, it goes deep. It goes deep. We might call it 3D or what have you. Um, my objective, my my intention, what I choose to choose as often as I think that I can, is the perspective which one admits of everything in this tantric way, and two doesn't ask of itself anything. Again, in this tantric way, is just a sitting with the ultimate unfolding, and ah doesn't I try my best to really abstain from placing conditions or criteria on the achievement or attainment of anything, because what I see happening here is one thing, one moment, one unfolding. Yeah. And the greater the extent to which I do this weird, wacky turn in consciousness of fully embracing, and you talk about embodying. Well, I want to embody all of it, none of it, both and neither, all those things. And I want what's embodied here to be so admitting of what it thinks it perceives and what it thinks it experiences, that I'm not the one creating my own resistance, right? I'm not the one. My perception of self is not the one slowing this train down, because healing, in my opinion, happens automatically. And by automatically, I mean something that the condition that's most often asked of us, or that we are invited to, I would say, uh, in the process of healing, is not you did this, you did it, you achieved it, you overcame that mountain. On the other hand, what I think is actually the mechanism at play is trust. And I think the mechanism at play is a kind of conditionless condition. It's most often more of a taking of our hands off the wheel, or a stopping white knuckling of the wheel and discovering that it's a self-driving car, than it is by dint of hard work and effort that we heal. Yeah.
Uh, I see and appreciate that difference. I hear what you're saying, and um it also, there is an element to what you're saying for me that is, I think, for the average person, maybe a little unattainable, or maybe a little pure, or maybe a little um
Mhm.
out of
Yeah.
reach in a way, you know. And I actually use the word practical to describe myself when I call myself a practical mystic, because
Yeah.
I do understand that people are in bodies that sometimes have struggles, and they often have children, and there's complexities of life, and they're in the nitty gritty of relationships where they're playing out their lineage stuff, and we're trying to figure out how to be here. And
Mhm.
again, as a feminine, erotic, devotional path, I'm not trying to ignore that. It's
Right.
really important to me to not ignore that,
Right.
to not reduce that down to, well, if we could have trust, or it's really only this moment, or it's, like, part of my wanting to be embodied is to be in the mess of it all. And so
Mhm.
when you're speaking, I feel like there's profound spiritual truths in that. And sometimes, I used to say this all the time when I was farming, and I lived in this community of people, and there were spiritual teachers coming. And I remember saying, all great spiritual teachers, but I would like them to teach me how to keep my chickens in the fence and have them not get killed by predators. That would be a really great spiritual lesson that I would like to learn. And otherwise, I'm not interested in going to that spiritual lecture. Right.
Right.
And so, and maybe this is my stellium and two earth signs of like, I'm really interested in, I'm really interested in what it is to be here, and,
Yeah.
and to be a mystic, embodied mystic, a practical mystic. So I think, I
Mhm.
think that when you speak of those things, I think, yes, philosophically, conceptually, cosmologically, you're probably right. But there's a limit to how juicy that can be for me. There's a limit
Mm,
to how that's going to help me keep my chickens in the fence, or cook a meal for my beloved, or care for my children, or pay my bills. Like there, and so I think for me, again, as a long time studying of the wise woman traditions and of earth-based traditions of land-based living, place-based, like I'm often wanting to bring it down into like really here. What's here? And that's, I think, where the marriage of what you and I are talking about, where the intersection,
mhm,
and maybe it's discordant, or maybe it's quibble, or maybe it's push, but it's actually
mhm.
rich, it's fertile right there, because
Right,
I want to understand how to trust, given a history of trauma where trust is a core issue, given my orientation towards something that I don't, a God that I don't actually believe in, that I was raised with. What does trust mean there, right there
right.
in that sweet spot? What is the agony and ecstasy of that concept of trust? I'm not really interested in it otherwise. I'm not interested in it as a philosophical concept. I'm interested in my guts. What is it in my actual body? So
Yeah.
I think that's where you and I are dancing around. And I don't know
Mhm,
that we're speaking
mhm.
so much like different ideas, but I think it is the yin yang of it. I think it is me saying, the very classical ways in India of conveying information. And one of my beloved friends and teachers, Rudaji, wrote a book. Swami Ravi wrote a book called Kali Rising, and it's done in the very same traditions as done as India, which is Shiva is telling a concept of something philosophical to Shakti, who then takes it into her body and is like, well, what does it mean in this concept? So you and I are still playing out this tantric principle where you're saying, but look at this. And I'm saying, I don't really care about that unless it can be in my life and in my heart and in my pussy and in my belly and in my body. Right?
Mhm.
Like, what does it mean there? And
Yeah,
what it means there is different to every single person given their circumstances. And if
right.
healing really can be quantum, meaning we don't have to worry about our lineage trauma. Yet, the experience is, wow, I've got this thing that I've been dealing with for decades. Like, how, can we be
Mm,
compassionate and empathetic and
right,
reflective of how hard that's been? So
right.
again, I think we're dancing in this place where it's a both and. I don't think it's necessarily a quibble.
I agree. Because when I'm first of all, I get this a lot. I've been on podcasts where, I was on a relationship podcast once, and, um, uh, my position was I was doubling down on the extent to which this is you. Like, this is you, and as a matter of fact, you and your relationship with you is primary, and all other relationships in your life are going to be sort of an outpouring and an outpicturing of that relationship. So, um,
Absolutely.
right. So doubling down on that to the extent, to the exclusion of, let's just put it that way, which is funny, right? Inclusive of everything, and yet exclusive of, um that's the turn for me. That's the turn where my spiritual pivot, this spine upon which I want the weight of the foundation of the earth and the weight of the sky and everything to just kind of be just uh perfectly situated upon, is to me the uh being aware of the extent to which I buy into this the story of separation
Mhm.
between
Mhm.
myself and
Mm.
anything else in my life, a memory, a narrative, God, uh, my body, time and
Mhm.
space. So like as I hear about the chickens, my message, like, so let's say it was me. Let's say it was me at the at giving the lecture, and someone stands up and says, "Yeah, but what about my chickens?" My response is, hmm, first of all, the choice to be at a spiritual lecture or something like that is you. And if what life has called you to attend to, if what you desire and what life has called you to attend to, the intersection of your narrative, your story, your sense of self, time and space, and all of that coming together in the moment, would actually rather have you elsewhere, or paradoxically also trusting, having taken the invitation to trust that in any message you desire your chickens. Well, one, trust take the invitation to trust that whatever's going on here, this relationship between self and other, consciousness, God, life, time, space, love, all of it kind of comes together at this point in which I can choose, I can make this choice to see myself as limited, see myself as what I would say, and I don't, this is not what you're saying, but merely embodied, and or embodied and all of it, embodied and divine, embodied and the center of the whole fucking universe, right? So as the sovereign center of the whole fucking universe, the whole sovereign center of the whole fucking universe doesn't necessarily, when it understands itself to be what it is, it doesn't question the nature of the lecture and its ability to render the answers that it seeks and that it desires about the chickens, because knock and the door shall be open to you, seek and you shall find, which includes chickens, and how not to,
Which includes chickens. Right.
right, it
I
does.
love
So
that. I love that. I need to
s-
wrap it up here soon,
yeah,
but I think that the core piece of where you and I have gotten is like we've gotten to the dance, to the core of the
yes,
dance.
yeah,
And I love that.
which is actually, it's exceptionally beautiful. It is
Mm,
exceptionally beautiful. The core and the dance and the difference, if we want to see it that way, as something going on here, is something that ooh, oh, it's delicious, because often in these kinds of conversations, when there is this, like, I'm like, well, I see myself as kind of standing, sort of upholding, not as a mantle or as a mission, but I'm here to represent that as a perspective, and as the possibility of, as an invitation which we can take in any moment in which we find ourselves. And then what I find so delicious and beautiful is that you're saying, well, yeah, there's a tension there. Of course there is. That's what it means to be embodied.
mhm, mhm.
So the deliciousness is in the very dance which you have explicated and called out, and we have said, look, well, yeah, that's called being here,
Mhm,
right?
mhm. I love it. I love that the conversation is highlighting, yeah, the perspectives. It's really good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Excellent. Dear Lee, thank you so much for coming. And I hope we can do this again when we feel like it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I love to see how you edit it and
Yeah.
what you make of it and what clips you're happy with. And let's do it
Why,
again.
why don't you let people know? We're still recording this, so why don't you let people know how they can find you and learn more about your work and all that?
Yeah, that's a great idea. Probably the best place right now is queenofdeath.org, and it's where I'm doing my death oriented work, which also includes my tantra based work. So
Yes.
once you get on my mailing list, then you'll be apprised of what's coming up for me.
Excellent. Queenofdeath.org. Thank you so much, Lee.
Mhm.
Much love to you, my friend.
Much love to you, Connor.